Okay, so let's take a look at something called DOM manipulation. So what is the DOM? Go and have a look at the text accompaniment to this lesson, and that will give you a much kind of deeper explanation of the DOM with pictures. But it's basically the document object model. And ultimately, what we can do using DOM manipulation is we can kind of change or create or remove elements from our HTML using JavaScript. So the first thing that I want to say about this lesson is many lessons I kind of approach and say, hey, you can use the starter code or you can write this on your own. What I would really recommend is actually using the starter code from this lesson, which you can download below. And the reason for that is I've written a bunch of HTML that will do just create some elements for us. And there's also a little bit of CSS here already that will just make things a little bit easier when we actually start doing things with our JavaScript DOM manipulation. So I'm just going to start my live server and we'll have a look at what we actually have in front of us. Okay, so if I just zoom in on here. So we have obviously a title for the page. We have this is a paragraph, and we have these are actually buttons and nothing happens, and we also have a square here, and this has an ID of square. Okay, let's move our windows around so I can get to everything. Actually, yes, you can see here we've got our title, it's in a container, and we've got a paragraph, some buttons, and we've also got a div with lots of buttons here with a class of color button. We also have that square here as well. Don't worry too much about the CSS. This is just to make sure that everything's got a size and has some colors that we can, we don't need to look at too closely. But the big one actually is in our app.js. So something to bear in mind here is that in our HTML, in our head here, we are loading in our scripts here in the head tag of our HTML. Now, HTML will run from top to bottom, so it loads in this script before it goes ahead and kind of creates any of these elements. Now, what you could do is you could put this script tag right down at the bottom of your body. I'm not really too keen on that method, but what that would do is it would load all of the elements here and then it would load the script. Again, I'm not really too keen on that method because there might be things that we want to do in our scripts before the website loads. We might have analytics scripts or something like that, for example. So it's good to actually have our script tag up here in the head of our HTML document. That does then come with a bit of a payoff or a bit of an issue in that when we actually want to do things with these elements, maybe we want to change text or something like that, it's possible that the code that we write in our JavaScript file kind of runs before the browser has made any of those elements. So the way that we can do this or kind of get around this issue is we can add an event listener to our window. So that's kind of everything inside our web page, the whole thing, all of the HTML. And we add an event listener and then we say, when all of the content is loaded, when that's happened, I want you to go and run everything in this function, in the init function. Now, this is quite a common way of making sure that anything inside this function only runs once our web page is kind of fully loaded, if you like. It's loaded all of those elements and it's drawn all of those elements to the browser. Don't worry if that doesn't make sense just yet, but basically, if you're doing any DOM manipulation, which is what we'll be learning about now, you need to make sure that you're using this event listener with DOM content loaded, and you have an init function. When you get a bit more used to writing code that does things with the DOM, then you can start changing this up. But for now, keep this as a rule. So what's some of the things that we can do with DOM manipulation? Well, first of all, let me just move around my screen a little bit. I'm going to keep open the index.html and the app.js. So the first thing that I'm going to do is when this button gets clicked, this change text button gets clicked, I'm going to go ahead and change this is a paragraph to something else. We'll have it say something else. Don't know what yet, but we will change it. So there's a process that we want to follow here, really. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to select the DOM elements. Then we need to add our event listeners. Don't worry if that doesn't make too much sense yet. We're going to come back to it. And then actually in the middle of these two, we need to do something or write a callback function. Again, don't worry if it doesn't make too much sense now. We will have a look at this. So let's just deal with, at the moment, the clicking of this change text button here. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to select that element. We need to go and get that button. So the way that we'll do that is we will save it into a variable for us to use. So let's say const change btn. Yeah, let's say it's the change button and text. Change button text. That sort of makes sense to me. That's what this button is going to do. And then we'll set this variable equal to, let me just move this out of the way so that you can see more of my screen. We will set this variable to document.querySelector. Now, this document.querySelector takes an argument of a CSS selector. Now, if we want to get this button change text, well, we can select it by its ID. Now, if you think back to your CSS selectors, how do we get by ID? Well, we need to give it a string, and then we'll say hash, because that's how we get the IDs, and then the ID of that button. So I'm just going to go back to the HTML, I'm going to right click and copy, or Command C, Control C on Windows, and paste it in here so that I don't make any typos. There's no point in trying to type it out. So if I save that now, what we should have here is that element. And in fact, we can prove that we have that element by saying console.log change button text. So if I save that and come over here and inspect, so open the console, you'll see that it's now given us the HTML of that button. Fantastic. And when we mouse over it, the browser's actually very helpful and is saying, hey, I think you mean this one over here. See how that highlights? So next, what we want to do is we want to listen for an event on this button. So the way that we do that is we get our element, our variable. So we'll say change button text. And then we want to say dot add event listener and add some parentheses. And this takes two arguments. It can take more, but we're going to focus on two. And the first one is the actual event that we want to listen for. So in this instance, we'll say click. And this is a string of the word click, all lowercase. Second argument is we will say, what do we want to happen when this is clicked? Now, we could go ahead and write a little callback function here, and that would be fine. We could say console.log clicked. And let's save this now. And when we click this button, we get clicked to the console. Brilliant. So if there's something really simple that you need to do, this might be one way of doing it. I think a slightly better way of doing this is actually not to put the callback function here, but is to instead write our function out here and then pass it in here. So what we'll do is we can say here, we can say function, and then think of a name for it. So let's say, we'll just call it change text. So we're just writing a function like we would any other. And just in here to check that it works, we'll say console.log button clicked. But what we need to do is we need to pass this callback function in as the second argument to our event listener. So how do we do that? We literally just say change, my apologies. We need to actually just pass in the name of this function. So change text. Now notice that I'm not invoking the function here. I'm not using parentheses here. We're passing the entire function down into the second argument of this event listener. Cool, so let's save that and see if that still works. Excellent, yep, we get button clicked. So let's just look at that for a moment. We're saying, hey, go and find this button using our query selector on our document. And we're saying we want the element with the ID of button change text. And we can see that here, the ID of button change text. Go and add an event listener to that element. And the event listener that we want to listen for is a clicking event. When that click happens, we want you to run this function, this change text function. And that's what's happening. We're getting console.log button clicked. Fantastic. Okay, now let's deal with actually changing that text that we want to change. So it'll follow a similar kind of thing where we need to select our DOM elements. Now, there will be no event listeners on it, and we're going to actually change the text in this change text function. However, we will still need to get that DOM element. So if you know how to do this, and you can tell from what we've already written, pause the video here and give it a go yourself. Let's do it together as well. So let's say const, and then we need to think of a name for this paragraph. So this has an ID of output, and we could call it that, absolutely. But this is just a variable in our JavaScript, so I'm going to call it paragraph. And this is going to be our document dot query selector. And then we're going to get it by the ID again. So the ID was output. Let's Command C that. And a string of ID output. So what we can do is, and I'm just going to actually delete these console.logs here because we don't need them now. We've proved that those things work. Is we'll say paragraph dot, and then there's a bunch of attributes that we can change on this paragraph. The one that we're concerned with is its text content. So we'll say paragraph.text content, and we'll just set this equal to some new text. Let's save that. And we obviously have nothing in a console, and we've got the default of this is a paragraph. Now let's click on our change text button. Fantastic. So we've actually changed this element here to say some new text. Now, of course, we've got no way of changing it back, but if we refresh the page, it goes back to the default that's in our HTML. And then we click change text, and we've got this down to some new text. Fantastic. So this is a way that we can use JavaScript to actually change parts of our HTML code. Let's go and change the style of our paragraph instead of just the text content. So we've got a button here actually in our HTML which says change style. So button change style. Excellent, let's use that. So this will give you a little bit of practice in writing more functions to change things on our page. So let's go ahead and grab that new button element. So we'll say const change style btn. I think that makes sense as a variable name. Now, we've been using query selector so far. I do just want to show you another one that you can use. We could say document dot get element by ID. And we can just pass it the string of the ID in here. So let's just go to our HTML and copy the ID here. And this will do pretty much exactly the same thing as if we'd used query selector and then the CSS selector for that element. Get element by ID you'll probably see in a lot of places. You'll also see get element by class name, and you'll also see get elements by ID, or sorry, get elements by class. So I'm just putting this here really to show you that there's different options for selecting those elements. Personally, I almost always exclusively use query selector or query selector all, which we'll come on to in a moment, because it gives you a lot more flexibility in selecting which elements you want to select. We'll leave this as it is now, just so that you've got an example for the future. So we want, when this button is clicked, we want to change our paragraph style. So go ahead and add an event listener. So change style button dot add event listener, and the event listener that we want to add is obviously our click. And then what do we want to run when we do this? Well, we'll want to run a function that we will call change style. Now it's entirely up to you whether you write the function first and then put it in here, or you write it here and then create your function. There's arguments for or against doing it one way over the other. So we'll say function change style, because that's what we've put here, add our parentheses and some curly brackets. So let's go ahead and now say we want to go to our paragraph dot style. Now you've got in here almost all of the kind of the CSS properties. They might not be written in exactly the same way. They might be written in a slightly more JavaScript-y kind of casing, but nearly everything that you can do in CSS, you can do here in JavaScript. So for example, if we want to change the color, we can change our color, and we can set this equal to, let's use the CSS color, let's say blue. Let's also say we want to change the font size. So we'll say paragraph.style.font size. is equal to, and then don't forget this does take a string, because when we're writing in CSS, we would be writing, say, 20 pixels or 20 EM or something like that. So it is a string of the value. So let's set this to, I don't know, 50 px. And let's just leave it at that. You'll notice that I've done this on 2 separate lines, because we can't sort of say paragraph.style.color.font size. We have to do this separately. So let's go ahead and save this now. Let's head back to our web page. So changing our text, yep, that still works. Change our style, hey, fantastic. We've changed the style on our element. Now, just something to bear in mind here. If we look at our elements here, and we look at our P here of this is a paragraph, when we do our change text, yes, we get some new text here. This has now changed. Currently, the styles are applied from our style sheet here. Now, when we change the styles by clicking this button, it doesn't change our CSS file. It doesn't input it into the CSS. It actually puts in inline styles here. So this is kind of good, because it means that it will overwrite any CSS styles for us, because inline styles take precedence over our style sheets. Just something to bear in mind there. Excellent. So clicking this button, it changes the styles here to whatever we've set in our JavaScript. Wonderful. Let's now do something a little bit more in depth. Let's add some elements to our web page. So again, this is quite simple. So what we can do is, again, we've got 2 different buttons here. So we've got an add element button and a remove element button here. So we're going to have to follow the normal process of selecting our DOM elements. So we'll say const add element button, or BTN, is document dot query selector, and then we will get it by its ID. Let's just double check what that is. So it's button add element and button remove element. Okay, great. Let's just copy that across. And again, a string hash, and paste that in, button add element. We know we're going to need to do the remove button as well. We might as well do that at the same time here. So I'm just going to copy this down. So using Option and Shift, or Alt and Shift. And then, so if I just select this here, I'm going to call this remove element button, and then also just edit this to say remove element. Wonderful. So don't forget that you do need to make sure that this ID corresponds to whatever's in the index. So make sure that they match. Great. So we should have available to us both our add element button and our remove element button from our HTML. We'll need to add some event listeners. So we'll say add element button dot add event listener. Of course, this needs to be a click. And what do we want to run? Well, we'll call our function add element. Of course, if this was something specific in a more complex web page, you should probably say what the element is. You know, maybe add product element or add user element or something like that. But for now, add element is probably fine. I'm going to again use Option Shift and down just to copy this line down and say remove element button, and we'll call our callback function for this remove element. So let's just go ahead and make those functions. So function add element. And down here, I'm going to also say function remove element. Don't forget your parentheses and your curly brackets. Great, so we can do some stuff in here and in here to add and remove elements. So let's go ahead and let's deal with just adding an element. So the first thing is that we need to do is we need to sort of create that element that will live in our JavaScript file to then add it to our document. So in here we can say const new element, and we'll set this equal to document dot create element. And what sort of element do we want it to create? So in this instance, we will just make some paragraphs, some paragraph elements. So we want a P. Don't forget to put this in a string. And then we've got this element now. So a little bit like when we had elements on our document in our HTML, and using query selector, we saved those into a variable. What we've got here is we've got this new P element in this variable here. Well, that means we can do stuff with it. So here we could say new element. We can use that variable and say dot something, and let's say text content, and set this to something. I am a new paragraph element. Fantastic. That's all very well and good, but whilst we'll be creating these elements, let's see what happens. So if I save this now, let's just in this add element, we do console.log add element function. And what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that when we click the button, we know that this function is running. So let's go back to the console and hit our add element function. Okay, so it is running because that console.log is actually logging to the console, but nothing is changing on our page. No elements have actually kind of been created, it seems. Well, that's because we haven't actually said where to put it or what to put it, kind of where to put it on the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we want all of our paragraphs to appear at the top of this container. So our container div here. So what we'll say here is now we could go and get our element up here in the DOM elements here, or we could just do it here in the add element. So we'll say document dot query selector, and then we'll get that container using the ID, so container. And then what we want to do is we want to append a child. We want to add a child to the end of this document, sort of inside this container. So what we'll say here is we'll say dot append child. And then what do we want to append? Well, we want to append this new element, don't we? So if we save that now, let's go back to our website. Oh, how cool is that? We're getting I am a new paragraph element because it's actually adding it to the end of our container. So if I go back to my elements here and we just refresh the page, let's have a look where this is actually showing up. So let's highlight our container. So our container here is highlighted just on the left panel. And when we click the add element, look over here in the console, and you'll see that it actually adds this new I'm a new paragraph to our container. You'll see again, it's highlighted inside that container. Brilliant. If we add it again, we get I'm a new paragraph. Fantastic. Right. Let's now look at removing elements. This might be a little confusing, but what we want to do in here is we want to grab the last element here and remove it. So what we're going to do is we'll say const, because we want to actually get that element that we want to remove, and we'll say last element equals document.query selector, because we want to actually get one of those elements.
Sorry, I don't know that.
And what element do we want? Well, we want the last P element on the page. So again, we can use queries, we can use CSS selectors. So I'm going to say P last child. If you remember back to the CSS Bento or the CSS Ice Cream Scoops game that you played, you'll be really good at these CSS selectors here. So what we want to do here is we want to do last element dot remove, and that will just completely remove the node, remove that element. Okay, so let's save this now. Let's just head to our console to see if we get any errors. Okay, so I'm going to add a couple of elements here, and then if I remove the elements, hey, fantastic, we actually get them removed. Oh, but I've just clicked that again, and we're getting an error here. Cannot read properties of null, reading remove. Well, that's because it only works when we actually have elements to remove. Well, let's put in a little failsafe here. So what we can do is we can say if last element is true, or if last element exists, so we'll say if last element here, then we want to do last element dot remove. Don't forget to move that up into your if statement. So if we save that now and we add some elements and we remove them, brilliant, because all it's doing is it's saying, well, hey, that last element doesn't remove, it doesn't exist, so I'm not going to bother running any of this code. Okay, so I have a little bit of a challenge for you now. What I'm going to ask you to do is to pause the video and try this yourself. But first I'm going to give you a brief of what I want you to complete. So if we scroll down on the page here, we'll be coming back to these buttons in a moment. But the challenge that I'm going to set you is this square here. What I want you to do is to change its color when your mouse moves over it. Now, you can choose any color you like, but I would suggest a bright color like blue, just the CSS blue color. But then I want you to change it to a different color when our mouse is no longer over the square. Now, there's a link down in the bottom of this lesson to a big long list of all of the events that you can use. I want you to go ahead and have a look at it. So if we just take a look at it now, you'll see that there's loads and loads of events available to us. I'm not going to tell you which one you need, but go and have a look through it to decide which are the most appropriate kind of events to use. I'll give you a clue, but when our mouse enters this element, we want it to change color, and then we want to change it to a different color when our mouse leaves it. So go ahead and have a look at that list of DOM events and choose which one is most appropriate, or which two events are most appropriate. Let's just have a think about the process that you're going to need to do. You're going to need to grab the element. You're going to need to add some event listeners to that element. And then you're also going to need to write a couple of functions to change the style of that element when those events occur. So please go ahead now, pause the video, and see how you get on. Okay, so I hope that went well for you. If it didn't, don't worry, we're going to go through it now. So the process that we need to follow is, first of all, we need to grab this element in order to add our event listeners to it. So up here in the top of our init function, I'm going to say const, and let's just call this a square. You may have called it something different, and that is absolutely fine. And we'll grab it with document.querySelector. And then let's just go and double check how we can do that. Oh, brilliant. It's got an ID of square. Fantastic. So I'm just going to copy that and say square there. Fantastic. That should have grabbed our element for us. Now down at the bottom here, with our event listeners, I'm going to say square dot add event listener. Now, what event listener do we want to add? Well, it's when our mouse enters that element. So let's go and have a look at our event list and see if there is one suitable. Now, of course, I'm going to this quite quickly because I do actually know what I want. Brilliant. We've got this mouse enter event here, and we can say, we know that when the pointer is moved onto an object, this will fire. Wonderful. Ooh, we've also got mouse leave as well. The pointer is moved out of an element. Okay, that might be quite interesting as well. Notice that we've got this mouse move here. The pointer is moved over an element. That might not be what we want, although some of you may have used it. What you'll probably notice is that every time your mouse moves on that object, it will fire that event. So I think the two that we need are this mouse enter and mouse leave. Okay, so let's get on with writing that. So we want to have a mouse enter, and we also want to add an event listener for mouse leave. Well, let's just use Option Shift and down to copy that, and we'll say mouse leave. Now we need a couple of callback functions. Let's call this one mouse over. I think that makes sense for this. And then we'll call this one mouse leave. I suppose that sort of makes sense. You can call these what you like, as long as it makes sense to you. So let's write our function of mouse over, add our parentheses, and then we can write what we want to happen in here. So what we want to do is we want to get our square. So we want to say square dot style dot background color. And you'll notice that this looks similar to the CSS way of doing it, but without the dash, we have this in camel case instead. And we can set this equal to whatever we want. I'm going to just set it to blue. So let's save that. We've got a little error here because mouse leave is not defined. No worries. But you see that? When I move my mouse over the square, brilliant, we get blue. Of course, when I move off it, nothing happens because we've not written that callback function yet. So let's go ahead and now write function mouse leave, and we'll say square dot style dot background color is equal to, I don't know, green. Let's save that. And hey, brilliant, we get blue, green, blue, green, blue, green. That works really well. Excellent work if you got that. If you didn't get that, that's absolutely fine. You'll be practicing this loads as we go through the course. You'll practice it loads in Module 1 and you'll practice it even more in the later modules too. Okay, so there is something that I do want to look at with you before we end this session. And we've got 4 buttons here. And basically what I want to do is change the colour of the button when you click on it. Now, of course, what we could do is we could go and we could select each individual DOM element. We could have button 1, query selector button 1, and so on and so forth. But there's an easier way of doing this. So what we can do is you'll see in our index.html, we've got these button 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they all have a class of color-btn. So wouldn't it be great if we could just go ahead and grab every single one of these elements all at once? Well, we can do that. So here in our selecting the DOM elements kind of section of our code, I'll say const color buttons equals document dot query selector all. And what this will do is it will select all of the elements with whatever selector we tell it. So I add my parentheses here, and we're going to select these by their class name. So how do we do that in CSS? Well, we do that with a dot, right? And we do that here as well. So let's just go ahead and copy the class name and paste it in here. Now let's have a look how this is a little bit different. So if we console.log out our color buttons and save that, you'll see that we now have this node list that has 4 elements in it. And if we expand this down, you'll see that each of these is a different element. Well, that's really handy. We've used one bit of code to select lots of elements. That makes it really nice and easy for us. And if we drop this down, don't worry too much about this, but these have all of the different properties and methods that we can use to manipulate it. So let's go ahead and add some event listeners to all of these. Now this is where it can get a little bit confusing, because what we've basically got here is it's something called a node list, but we can treat it in JavaScript very much like we can treat an array. So I'm just going to comment this out so that we don't fill up our console. But down here, when we're adding our event listeners, instead of using just the variable name and then add event listener, what we're going to do is we're going to use a for each. So we'll get our node list of color buttons, and then we'll say dot for each, and then we need a callback function for our for each. So let's say button so that we've got each individual element. We'll use a fat arrow, and then we'll write our code here. So we'll say for every btn, for every button, we'll say button dot add event listener, and we want to add a click event to each of them, and then we want to run a callback function. So we will just say change btn color. That's what we'll name this function. And need to spell that correctly. So every single one of our color buttons will have an event listener added to it of click, and it will run this change button color function when that happens. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's make that change button color function. Function change button color and our parentheses and our curly brackets. Now, this is where it can get a little bit confusing because, of course, we've got 4 buttons here and we don't know which one that has been clicked. Well, we kind of do. So in this, when this callback function is called, when it's invoked, when this is clicked, we will have passed into it something called the event. Now, the event object is a huge object with loads and loads of data and information on it. But what we're interested in is we want to just change the background color of whichever button we have clicked. So we can do that by saying, hey, go into the event object, and then we want to select the target, whichever element has had the event fired on it. So the event.target, and then what do we want to do? We want to say we want it to be the style, and we want the background color to be, let's say, red. Of course, we can actually put in hex codes here. So we can say hash, and I'm going to set this to, it can be anything, but I'll just set it to FF00FF. So this will be, I don't know what color this will be, but that's what we will set it to. So if we save this here, and now if we click button 2, we now actually get only button 2 has its color changed, because we're saying on the click event, whichever one has been targeted, whichever element was the target of that event, that's the one that we want to change the background color of. So yeah, let's just make sure it works with all of them. Fantastic. That works. Fantastic. That works. Let's just refresh the page, and yep, we can see that it only targets the one that we've clicked.